For over 2,000 years, one dynasty's fate has been inextricably entwined with the story of an entire nation, Japan. The Yamato Dynasty, Japan's imperial family, claims an unbroken lineage reaching back into the haze of legend. Its origins are said to be divine, ordained by the sun goddess herself. The Chrysanthemum Throne, as the imperial seat is known, stands as one of the oldest continuous institutions in human history, a span unmatched by any other royal line on earth, truly extraordinary. Across the world, dynasties have risen and fallen with the tides of time, now mere footnotes in history. Egypt's pharaohs, China's emperors, Rome's Caesars, and countless others are now the stuff of legend and textbooks. Yet in Japan, the same bloodline has occupied the throne, though every era, from antiquity to modernity, enduring for over 1,000 years, even before Charlemagne was crowned in Europe. This extraordinary continuity has imbued the Chrysanthemum Throne with a mystique unlike any other, making it a cornerstone of Japanese identity throughout the ages. Though eras of war and peace, isolation and openness, feudal division and modern unity, the Yamato sovereigns have endured against all odds. They have presided over Japan's transformations, sometimes as mighty rulers shaping events, and often as symbolic figureheads carried along by currents beyond their control. From ancient emperors regarded as living deities to monarchs reduced to ceremonial roles under shogun warlords, their saga mirrors the epic journey of Japan itself. It is a tale of resilience and adaptation, of glory and sacrifice, of a throne that has been at times venerated and at times relegated to the shadows, yet never toppled. This dynasty has weathered foreign invasions and civil strife, serving both as a beacon of unity and an instrument of militarist zeal. The story of Japan's eternal throne is thus a story of paradox, a power rooted not in force of arms, but in the enduring idea of legitimacy and continuity. From the mythical first emperor, though golden ages and dark chapters, to its role in the present day, the Yamato line has outlasted every upheaval. In the chapters that follow, we will journey through the epochs of Japanese history, seen through the prism of its imperial family, witnessing how a single dynasty could remain the constant thread, weaving together Japan's identity, even as the nation transformed around it, defying all odds. In the midst of antiquity, Japanese history and mythology intertwine at the cradle of the Yamato dynasty. According to tradition, the very first emperor, Jimmu, ascended the throne in 660 before Common Era with the divine mandate of his ancestor, the sun goddess Amaterasu. This sacred origin story defined everything. In Shinto lore, Jimmu carried sacred regalia, a mirror, a sword, and a jewel. These were emblems of heavenly authority passed down to him to rule the terrestrial realm. Whether Jimmu himself was a literal historical figure or a legendary progenitor is uncertain, but the tale gave the emerging Yamato clan a potent claim. The right to rule, they asserted, came directly from the gods, setting them apart from all other mortal chieftains in the archipelago. In reality, as the fog of myth clears, we find a powerful clan coalescing in the fertile plains of Yamato, modern Nara Prefecture, around the 1st centuries CE. These early Yamato rulers were warrior kings and priest kings in equal measure. They led armies against rival tribes and offered prayers to kami spirits to ensure bountiful harvests. Massive burial mounds, known as kofun, began to dot the landscape, testifying to the authority of these ancient sovereigns. Within these tombs, archaeologists found armor, bronze mirrors, and swords, suggesting a society where war and ritual went hand in hand. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Yamato domain had expanded, forging alliances through marriage with other clans and subjugating those who resisted. Bit by bit, a patchwork of feuding chieftains was knit into a rudimentary kingdom under Yamato leadership. Early chronicles from abroad offer tantalizing glimpses of this formative era. Chinese historians wrote of the land of Hua and its kings who sought recognition from the great empires on the mainland. Envoys from Yamato journeyed across the sea to the courts of China, bearing tribute and returning with knowledge, prestige, and perhaps new ideas of statecraft. These interactions hinted that the Yamato chiefs aspired to more than local dominion. They sought a place in the Sinic world order. Step by step, the Yamato dynasty was laying the groundwork for an imperial institution. What had begun as a myth of divine descent was evolving into a political reality, a centralized kingship that could command both spiritual allegiance and martial loyalty across many provinces. One Chinese chronicle from the 3rd century even spoke of a shamaness queen named Himiko who ruled the people of Hua and sent tributes to the Wei court. While Himiko's name does not appear in Japan's late imperial histories, her tale hints at how fluid early leadership could be, foreshadowing the sacred aura of Yamato monarchs. Yet, even as the Yamato house extended its reach, it faced formidable challenges. Powerful regional clans such as Izumo in the west and Kumaso in southern Kyushu contested Yamato's supremacy. Court legends speak of heroic expeditions by Yamato warriors, like the tale of Prince Yamato Takeru. Whether through force or diplomacy, by the dawn of the 6th century, the Yamato rulers had largely secured their preeminence over central and western Japan. With rival chieftains subdued or co-opted, the Yamato kings began to envision themselves not merely as first among equals, but as sovereigns of a unified realm. They adopted grand titles that hinted at universal authority, setting the stage for the late use of the term Tenno, meaning heavenly sovereign, for the Japanese monarch. The age of constant clan warfare was gradually giving way to a nascent state, with the Yamato dynasty at its head. Now cloaked in the mantle of divine right as well as martial might, the foundation was laid for the next epoch, when this sacred kingship would transform into a true imperial institution under the influence of new ideas flowing in from across the sea. Japan was about to change profoundly. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the Yamato rulers were poised to turn their chieftain's realm into a true imperial state. The catalyst for this transformation was a conscious effort to learn from the great civilization of China. Waves of ideas, technology, and religion came across the seas. Foremost among these imports was Buddhism, which arrived around the mid-6th century and quickly found patrons in the Yamato court. Embracing this sophisticated foreign faith signaled a new era. The ruling clan, once grounded solely in native Shinto belief, now saw the advantage of aligning with Buddhism's statecraft. However, the new religion also ignited rivalries. Conservative clans like the Mononobe resisted it, while the pro-Buddhist Soga clan gained influence by championing the Buddha's cause. After a power struggle replete with palace intrigue and violence, the Soga prevailed, securing Buddhism's imperial foothold. Amid these changes rose one of the Yamato dynasty's brightest luminaries, Prince Shotoku. In the early 7th century, Shotoku, serving as regent to his aunt, Empress Suiko, became the architect of sweeping reforms. A devout Buddhist and keen student of Chinese governance, he issued a 17-article constitution. This document laid down principles for an orderly state, guided by Confucian ethics and harmony, urging officials to uphold centralized imperial authority. Prince Shotoku also established an official calendar, promoted Buddhism, and famously dispatched envoys to China's Sui dynasty, boldly addressing the Chinese emperor as an equal. Under Shotoku's guidance, the Yamato monarch began to be seen less as a tribal chief and more as an exalted sovereign in the Sinic mold, a son of heaven presiding over a realm governed by law and virtue. The drive to remake Japan along Chinese lines accelerated with the Taika reform of 645. In a dramatic incident within the palace, the young Prince Naka no Oi, later Emperor Tenji, and his allies assassinated the head of the Soga clan during a court ceremony, ending that family's dominance overnight. Seizing the reins of power, Prince Nakanooi and his ally, Kamatari of the Nakatomi clan, announced sweeping changes. They declared that lands and people henceforth belonged not to local clans, but to the emperor. A Chinese-style census and taxation system were introduced to bind the populace directly to the throne. The reforms aimed to curtail the independent might of regional nobility by replacing their private fiefs with imperial provinces. Administered by court-appointed governors, these policies culminated in comprehensive legal codes such as the Taiho Code of 701, which outlined a rigid administrative hierarchy with the emperor at its pinnacle. In these codes, the monarch was no longer just the first among noble equals, but the source of all authority. An emperor, in the fullest sense, akin to the Tang dynasty rulers in China. With a new bureaucratic code taking shape, the imperial court sought a fitting stage for its grandeur. In 710, a permanent capital was established at Nara, designed on a grid plan after the Chinese capital Chang'an. Nara became the dazzling heat of the nascent Japanese state, a city of pagodas and palaces where silk-robed courtiers conducted rites and governance under the emperor's gaze. Even as grand temples rose and new laws took hold, the court sought to cement the very story of the imperial line in writing. Scholars commissioned by the throne compiled Japan's first chronicles, the Kojiki record of ancient matters in 712, and the Nihon Shoki, Chronicles of Japan, in 720. These texts wove together myth and recorded events, tracing the lineage of emperors back to the creation of the world, and the descent of the sun goddess's grandson to earth. By committing the imperial mystique to parchment, the Yamato rulers enforced the notion that this was a sacred mandate. The chronicles served not only as national history, but as political theology, underscoring the imperial house's cosmic centrality. With a divine past officially inscribed and a bureaucratic state taking shape, the foundations of the Japanese nation were firming up around its august center. The emperors of the Nara period, such as Shomu, lavishly patronized Buddhism as a pillar of state unity. Emperor Shomu in the 8th century ordered the casting of a colossal bronze Buddha and the construction of Todaiji Temple to house it, then the largest wooden building on earth. This great Buddha project was as much a spiritual undertaking as a political one, proclaiming the emperor as protector of all people, and that the realm's prosperity was intertwined with sacred virtue. Yet, beneath the surface of this imperial fluorescence, old patterns of power persisted. The Fujiwara clan, descendants of the Emperor Kamatari, positioned themselves as kingmakers and imperial in-laws, marrying their daughters into the royal line. To be a future emperor, emperors still relied on alliances with noble families and priests to govern, and in some cases, those figures behind the throne grew bold. In the 760s, Empress Koken, also known as Shotoku, fell under the sway of a Buddhist monk named Dokyo, who gained extraordinary influence at court. Legend even suggests Dokyo aspired to ascend the throne himself, something that alarmed the aristocracy and perhaps tarnished the prestige of the imperial institution. In response, powerful courtiers moved to check such threats. One outcome was an informal taboo against female emperors, which endured for centuries. Sensing the need to assert the dynasty's primacy and escape the web of intrigues in Nara, Emperor Kanmu undertook a momentous move. In 794, he shifted the capital to a fresh location, a place free from the powerful Buddhist monasteries and factional memories of Nara. He chose Heian, present-day Kyoto, a site nestled amid hills and vines. There, a new capital was built from scratch, its streets laid out in orderly grids, its grand avenues symbolizing an imperial order restored. The move to Heian marked the dawn of a new epoch, a golden age for the court. With the court's center of gravity relocated and the excesses of the Nara era left behind, the Yamato dynasty stood at the height of its refined power. Little could Kanmu have foreseen that even as culture blossomed around the throne, political power would soon begin slipping through imperial fingers. The relocation to Heian Kyoto ushered in a golden age for the Yamato court, an era famed for its elegant culture and refined court life. In the centuries that followed Kanmu's move, roughly from 794 to 1185, the imperial capital became a world unto itself, a place of exquisite art, poetry, and ritual. It was in this milieu that classics of Japanese literature were born. Murasaki Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting, penned The Tale of Genji, often called the world's first novel, painting a vivid portrait of love and intrigue among nobles. Another court lady, Sei Shonagon, wrote the witty Pillow Book. At the center of this glittering world sat the emperor on the Chrysanthemum Throne, revered in theory as the supreme ruler of the realm. In practice, however, real political power during the Heian period slipped into the hands of an increasingly influential noble family, the Fujiwara. The Fujiwara clan mastered the art of ruling from the shadows. Descendants of the statesmen who helped launch the Taika reform, the Fujiwara became the imperial family's in-laws and regents, generation after generation. They orchestrated marriages so that virtually every emperor was born to a Fujiwara mother, making the material grandfather or uncle, often the Fujiwara patriarch, the power behind the throne. By the 10th century, Fujiwara regents, Sessho for child emperors and Kampaku for adult emperors, routinely governed in the emperor's name, handling state affairs while the monarch performed ceremonial duties. Some emperors bristled at this arrangement. A few energetic sovereigns, like Emperor Daigo in the 10th century, briefly managed to rule in their own right, asserting personal authority. But more often, youthful emperors were manipulated or encouraged to abdicate early, clearing the way for a younger successor under Fujiwara tutelage. The imperial institution persisted as a sacred symbol, yet the actual governance of Japan increasingly became a family affair of the Fujiwara, run from their mansions in the capital. Amid this political marginalization of the throne, a clever counter-strategy emerged from the emperors themselves: cloistered rule. In 1086, Emperor Shirakawa abdicated in favor of his young son, but rather than fading into obscurity, the former emperor took Buddhist vows and established a new power center as a cloistered emperor in a monastery. From behind monastery walls, Shirakawa and his successors continued to exert influence, issuing edicts and controlling court appointments, sometimes in competition with Fujiwara agents. This odd dual government, one part led by retired emperors in monks' robes, the other by the Fujiwara aristocrats, created a delicate balance. For a time, it checked the Fujiwara dominance and allowed the imperial line a backdoor route to guide state affairs. But it also added another layer of intrigue to court politics. While the elite in Heian schemed and traded poems far beyond the capital, a different breed of power brokers was on the rise: provincial warriors, samurai. The samurai grew in strength as they protected estates and quelled bandits. Two clans in particular, the Minamoto Genji and the Taira Heike, both distantly related to the imperial line, amassed military might. Initially, the court had used these warrior clans as tools, dispatching them to put down rebellions. But by the 12th century, the samurai were no longer content to remain mere enforcers for court nobles. In 1156 and 1159, disputes over imperial succession and the rivalry between cloistered and reigning emperors sparked the Hogan and Heiji disturbances, brief but bloody conflicts in the streets of Kyoto. These clashes saw the Minamoto and Taira factions back different court figures. In their aftermath, one man emerged preeminent: Taira no Kiyomori. Kiyomori became the first samurai warlord to dominate the government. Flushed with victory, he bypassed the Fujiwara and married his daughter into the imperial family, securing that his infant grandson would sit on the throne as Emperor Antoku. As the de facto ruler, Kiyomori allocated high offices for his kinsmen and doled out land to loyal samurai, all while keeping the young emperor under his thumb. The court society, so long insulated from violence, was shaken. The delicate balance of the Heian Ode was destroyed. Neither the cloistered emperor nor the Fujiwara regents could curb the Taira's ascendancy. The reaction to Taira dominance was swift and fateful. In 1880, calls to arms rose against Kiyomori's regime, led by the rival Minamoto clan and resentful warlords. A tied emperor, Go-Shirakawa, who had been effectively Kiyomori's captive, secretly sanctioned the uprising. Thus began the Genpei War, an epic national conflict culminating in a naval showdown at Dan no Ura. There, the Minamoto forces obliterated the Taira. The child Emperor Antoku, Kiyomori's grandson, met a tragic fate. Rather than let him be taken, his grandmother embraced the 7-year-old boy and leapt into the waves. In the war's wake, Minamoto no Yoritomo stood as the paramount military power. In 1192, he obtained from the court a new title, shogun, the Babayan quelling generalissimo. With that, he established a military government in Kamakura, far from Kyoto, and the long Heian era of aristocratic rule gave way to the age of the samurai. The emperor remained on his throne in name, but a new reality had dawned. Henceforth, the sword would hold sway. And the Chrysanthemum Throne would often survive only by accommodating itself to the warlord's might. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate in 1192 marked a drastic shift in the balance of power. For the first time, Japan had a permanent military government led by Shogun Minamoto no Yoritomo. Existing parallel to the imperial court, the emperor still reigned in Kyoto, but effective rule now lay with the samurai lords in Kamakura. Yoritomo was careful to preserve the veneer of imperial legitimacy, governing as the appointed shogun, an office granted by the emperor. In practice, however, the shogun and his vassals did not answer to the court. It was the court that was expected to acquiesce to the shogun's decisions. Thus, the Chrysanthemum Throne, while still revered, entered a long period of political eclipse, its occupant a largely powerless figurehead, caught in the shadow of a waiver regime. During the Kamakura era, 1192 to 1333, the emperors of Japan retained important symbolic and religious roles, but found their secular authority tightly circumscribed. The shogunate controlled appointments, land grants, and military affairs, while the court in Kyoto was left to occupy itself with ceremonies, scholarships, and the maintenance of cultural traditions. Now and again, a bold emperor attempted to buck this subordinate status. The most dramatic early challenge came from Emperor Go-Toba in 1221. Chafing under samurai oversight, Go-Toba plotted to overthrow the Kamakura government and restore direct imperial rule. He allied a handful of court nobles and western clans in what became known as the Jokyu War. But the imperial loyalist forces were swiftly crushed by the shogun's experienced armies. The victorious Kamakura regent from the Hojo clan, who governed as regents for the shogun, exiled Go-Toba to a remote island and installed a pliant new emperor. In the aftermath, the Hojo regents tightened control, even setting rules that emperors should periodically abdicate to ensure no one monarch plotted rebellion. The lesson was clear. While the shogun's wit and thought governed the land, the emperor could not hope to rule by might. The Kamakura period also tested Japan with external threats that further defined the emperor's role as spiritual guardian, even as samurai fought the physical battles. In 1274 and again in 1281, Mongol armies dispatched by Kublai Khan attempted to invade Japan. The imperial court, alarmed, offered prayers at innumerable shrines for divine protection of the sacred realm. Fierce fighting raged on the beaches of Kyushu as the invaders landed. According to chronicles, even as samurai swords and arrows struggled, the heavenly gods seemed to intervene. Both invasion fleets were wrecked by sudden typhoons. These storms, hailed as kamikaze or divine winds, were seen as a sign that the gods still favored the emperor and his land. The Mongol invasions were repelled, preserving Japan's independence. Yet, the victory brought little joy to the Kamakura government. The war left the treasury stained and the warriors disgruntled. There were no lands of riches to distribute as rewards, since no new territory was won. Discontent simmered among the samurai class, weakening their loyalty to the Hojo regents in the decades after the Mongol threat. By the early 14th century, cracks had formed in the Kamakura regime's foundations. Into this atmosphere of unrest stepped Emperor Go-Daigo, a determined monarch. He believed the time was ripe to restore imperial power. In 1331, Go-Daigo launched a daring rebellion against the shogunate. Though initially defeated and exiled, his cause was taken up by powerful samurai who had their own grievances against Kamakura's rule. One such ally was Ashikaga Takauji, a prominent general sent by the shogunate to put down the rebellion. Instead, Takauji turned on his masters and joined forces with the imperial loyalists. In 1333, Kamakura fell to the insurgents as loyalist forces sacked the city, bringing the 141-year-old shogunate crashing down. Emperor Go-Daigo's triumph was brief but significant. He entered Kyoto as a store of imperial rule in what is known as the Meiji Restoration. Go-Daigo ejected the title of shogun for his military commanders and attempted to govern personally, reviving classical court practices and seeking allies outside traditional elites. But his idealistic vision of turning back the clock to a strong imperial monarchy soon faltered. The samurai who had helped him expected a lion's share of power and land. They grew restive under an emperor who seemed not to appreciate the new realities of warrior rule. Within only 3 years, Go-Daigo's tenuous revival of imperial primacy was betrayed. In 1336, Ashikaga Takauji, dissatisfied with his rewards, marched on Kyoto. Go-Daigo fled the capital with the sacred regalia, refusing to surrender his claim. Takauji installed a rival prince on the throne in Kyoto as Emperor Komyo, and then assumed the title of shogun for himself in 1338. For the first time in history, Japan now had 2 competing imperial courts. Go-Daigo and his heirs established themselves in the southern stronghold of Yoshino, while the Ashikaga shogunate backed a sequence of northern emperors in Kyoto. Thus, the county was plunged into an era of divided sovereignty, known as the Nanbokucho, or Northern and Southern Courts period. The very notion of an unbroken singular imperial lineage was put to the test, as 2 lines of emperors, each claiming legitimacy from the sun goddess, vied for recognition. Though the conflict was as much about which samurai faction would dominate as it was about imperial legitimacy, the sight of rival emperors was a poignant symbol of how deeply the unity of the Chrysanthemum Throne had been fractured. It would take decades of sporadic warfare before the split was mended. The resolution of the Northern and Southern Courts conflict in 1392 finally healed the imperial schism. The Southern Court relinquished the sacred regalia to the Northern Court's emperor under a promise of alternating the throne, a promise the Ashikaga shogunate failed to honor. Henceforth, the lineage of the Northern Court became the sole imperial line, and the idea of an unbroken succession was officially restored, albeit by quietly abolishing the decades of division. The Ashikaga shoguns, nominally loyal, treated the emperor with a mixture of reverence and neglect. Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu had himself appointed deputy king by the Ming Chinese emperor, raising eyebrows. Yet, he also patronized the arts and rebuilt Kyoto. Emperors performed ceremonies, but their court was impoverished and politically marginal. That control, however, was tenuous and waned over time. In 1467, a dispute over shogunal succession ignited the Onin War, a calamitous conflict that reduced Kyoto to ashes. The great palaces and temples lay in charred ruins, and highborn counties found themselves starving or fleeing as violence consumed the land. This ushered in a century of anarchy, known as the Sengoku of Warring States period. With the capital in ruins and central authority collapsed, the emperor's fortunes reached their nadir. Successive emperors in the late 15th and 16th centuries struggled simply to keep the imperial institution alive, lacking revenue. Emperor Go-Na, who reigned from 1526 to 1557, was so destitute that he reportedly sold his calligraphy and poetry for meager income. At one point, imperial messengers had to implore help from rising warlord families just to finance the enthronement ceremony of a new emperor. It was a bitter historical irony. The throne that once commanded allegiance now depended on the charity of those lords for its very upkeep. Yet even in these darkest times, the aura of the Chrysanthemum Throne endured as a source of legitimacy no warlord could afford to ignore. The feuding daimyo continued to crave imperial titles, ranks, and courteous recognition to bolster their standing. The great warlord Oda Nobunaga, after seizing Kyoto in 1568, chose not to abolish the moribund Ashikaga shogunate immediately. Instead, he invited Emperor Ogimachi to continue as figurehead and even sponsored court ceremonies. While he manipulated politics from behind the scenes, Nobunaga understood that ruling in the emperor's name conferred a legitimacy that naked force alone could not. The Yamato dynasty's very weakness had become its shield. None of the ambitious unifiers sought to usurp the throne, they sought its blessing. Nobunaga's successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, went even further in venerating the court. Born a commoner, Hideyoshi could never claim the title of shogun. So he obtained the post of imperial regent through lavish gifts and flattery, winning favor with Emperor Ogimachi and his successor Go-Yozei, who granted him high court ranks and the surname Toyotomi. Hideyoshi provided funds to rebuild the imperial palace and sponsored expensive court rituals. He even secured the emperor's nominal approval for his grand but ill-fated invasions of Korea, casting them as imperial commands. In truth, the aging Emperor Go-Yozei had little choice but to comply with the dictates of the man who held Japan in his iron grip. Still, Hideyoshi's solicitude toward the throne ensured the imperial family's continuity. When Tokugawa Ieyasu seized power and triumphed at Sekigahara in 1600, he too understood this need. In 1603, Ieyasu obtained the title of shogun from Emperor Go-Yozei, formally establishing the Tokugawa shogunate. Thus ended the violent Sengoku era and began a new era of peace under Tokugawa rule. Once again, the pattern asserted itself. The emperor was consigned to ceremonial duties while real governance moved elsewhere. But crucially, throughout the centuries of strife, the Yamato dynasty had survived by bending when necessary, by yielding temporary power to whomever could actually wield it. The imperial institution outlasted the might of the Minamoto, the Ashikaga, and now the Tokugawa. It remained the sacred wellspring of legitimacy, even if in the early 17th century that wellspring seemed more like a quiet, still pond, reflecting a glory from long ago. The stage was now set for over 250 years of Tokugawa hegemony, a time when the imperial flame would be kept alive in seclusion, awaiting the moment when the winds of change would make it on its way back to life. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, 1603 to 1867, Japan enjoyed a long stretch of stability and isolation. In this peace, the emperor's role was more ceremonial than ever. The shoguns, ruling from Edo, kept the imperial court in Kyoto on a tight leash. They ensured the emperors stayed out of politics by providing just enough financial support to maintain dignity, but forbidding any real interference in governance. An office called the Kyoto Shoshidai acted as the shogun's representative, supervising court affairs. The message was unmistakable. The throne was to be venerated, but politically inept. Meanwhile, the county beyond the palace gates was changing. Bustling castle towns, a wealthy merchant class, and vibrant new art forms like kabuki theater and haiku poetry flourished. Edo itself grew into one of the world's most populous cities. Yet, the imperial court remained largely a spectator, secluded in its austere world of tradition and ceremony. Ironically, the very untouchability of the emperor as a sacred figure now served the interests of those who would eventually topple the Tokugawa. By the mid-19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate faced mounting crisis. Foreign powers led by the United States arrived in 1853, demanding Japan end its isolation, and the shogunate's compliance with these demands exposed it to internal criticism. A rallying cry arose among discontented samurai and nobles: "Son no joy." Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. To traditionalists and ambitious regional lords, the emperor, secluded in Kyoto, became a potent symbol of pure Japanese authority, unsullied by compromise with foreigners. Emperor Komei reigned 1846 to 1867, took the unusual step of openly opposing the shogunate's foreign concessions. In 1863, he even issued an imperial edict ordering the expulsion of all foreign merchants and missionaries. Though Komei lacked armies, his public stance gave domains like Choshu and Satsuma a revered banner under which to align. As the Tokugawa grip weakened, key factions maneuvered to restore power to the throne. In 1867, the last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, aware of his weakening position, agreed to return the governing authority to the imperial court, hoping to preserve some influence. But militant loyalists were unwilling to settle for half measures. In January 1868, young Emperor Meiji, just 15 years old, was declared the rightful source of political power, and shogunate officials were banned from the new government. When Yoshinobu resisted and clashes erupted near Kyoto, the Boshin War imperial forces allied under the emperor's name. By mid-1869, the imperial loyalists defeated the last Tokugawa strongholds. The shogunate was extinguished, and with it, over 6.5 centuries of samurai rule from behind the scenes came to an end. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was a watershed that fundamentally reinvented the Japanese monarchy. Emperor Meiji Mutsuhito moved to Edo, renamed Tokyo, bringing the throne physically and symbolically to the center of national life. A new government of youthful reforms proclaimed that Japan would modernize and strengthen under the sacred authority of the emperor. In reality, these leaders, known as the Meiji oligarchs, wielded the power, but they did so in the emperor's name, carefully crafting an image of a rejuvenated monarch. Leading his people into the modern world, the court itself underwent transformation. Emperors of old had been shielded, nearly invisible to the public, but Meiji's handling broke tradition by having him appear in Western military uniform, review troops, and take on an active role in state ceremonies. In 1889, a constitution was promulgated that formalized the emperor's position as head of state with godlike sovereignty, no longer a mere figurehead, at least on paper. The document, while actually enabling a cabinet and elected diet to share governance, enshrined the emperor as the heart of the new nation-state. Thus, after centuries, the pendulum had swung. The Chrysanthemum Throne, once relegated to near irrelevance, now shone as the fulcrum of Japan's ambitious drive to catch up with the West. The ancient line of Yamato had not only survived, it had been restored to a place of central prominence, albeit in a thoroughly transformed society. In the decades after the Meiji Restoration, Japan hurtled into the modern age, and the Yamato Dynasty became the galvanizing center of a newly assertive empire. Emperor Meiji's reign, 1868 to 1912, oversaw rapid industrialization, the building of railways and factories, the adoption of Western-style education and governance, and the forging of a modern conscript army and navy. As the new army and society took shape, the once secluded monarch began to play a more visible role. During the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, Emperor Meiji personally issued a script urging rebels to desist and appeared in army uniform to review troops. A powerful symbolic act showing that the throne now stood at the forefront of national unity. Throughout these drastic changes, the figure of the emperor was carefully cultivated as a unifying national symbol. The government promoted Shinto as a state religion, with the emperor at its core. Traditional myths were repackaged to bolster patriotism. The emperor was said to be the divine father of the people, and loyalty to him was extolled as the highest virtue. Schoolchildren bowed to the emperor's portrait each morning, and subjects were taught that their lives belonged to the throne. In reality, Emperor Meiji himself, though revered, rarely intervened in day-to-day politics, leaving decisions to his ministers. But when Japan went to war, first against China, then against Imperial Russia, it was in Meiji's name that troops marched, and under his chrysanthemum crest that victories were won. These triumphs abroad stirred fierce pride at home. Japan had transformed from a feudal hermit kingdom into an imperial power. As Japan's empire expanded, so did the mystique surrounding the emperor. In 1890, the imperial rescript on education was issued, declaring loyalty and filial piety as national principles, tying mortality directly to obedience to the emperor. When Emperor Meiji died in 1912, the nation went into deep mourning. His son, Emperor Taisho, ascended the throne at a time when Japan seemed poised between tradition and modernity. Taisho's reign, 1912-1926, saw the flowering of a nascent democracy. Political parties gained influence and the press flourished. Yet the imperial institution remained beyond public criticism, cocooned in reverence. Emperor Taisho himself was physically fragile and played little direct role. By the time Emperor Showa Hirohito assumed the throne in 1926, dark clouds were gathering. The late 1920s and 1930s brought economic hardship and a rising tide of militarism. Radical officers and nationalist societies preached restoring Japan's samurai spirit and smashing court party politics. Once again, the emperor's name became a tool for those seeking to seize power. Young Amy hotheads, convinced they were acting in the emperor's true interests, assassinated liberal politicians, claiming to sweep away those who betrayed the imperial will. In 1931, rogue military units orchestrated the invasion of Manchuria without explicit authorization from Tokyo. Afterwards, the civilian government felt compelled to accept the fait accompli. As Japan slid into authoritarian rule, Emperor Hirohito remained a remote figure, visible mostly in carefully stage-managed events. But within the military, his status as a living god was a constant refrain. Though historians still debate Hirohito's personal complicity, it is clear that the cult of the emperor shielded and empowered the militarists. Acts undertaken at the army's behest were justified as carrying out the sacred imperial will. Dissent was crushed as subversive disrespect to the throne. By 1937, Japan was embroiled on a full-scale war in China, and by 1940 it had entered into alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In 1940, the government staged grand national festivities to commemorate the 2600th anniversary of the empire's founding, stoking ultra-nationalist fervor. As the 1940s dawned, Emperor Hirohito performed imperial rituals, paying for victory. Even as his generals planned a bold strike to eliminate Western influence in Asia, the stage was set for the most destructive chapter yet. On December 8, 1941, Tokyo time, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, propelling the nation into a cataclysmic war with the Western powers. In the imperial rescript declaring war, Emperor Hirohito's voice, though written words read by a court official, proclaimed the aim of preserving the empire's position in East Asia. For the next 4 years, Japanese soldiers and civilians would fight under the slogan, "Serve the Emperor." The Pacific War proved both the apex of the empire's cult and the beginning of its undoing. Victories in the early years were celebrated as evidence of the emperor's divine protection. But as the tide turned against Japan, the invincibility of the imperial war banner began to fray. By 1944, with American bombers reducing Japanese cities to ash, the myth of the emperor's army as unbeatable began to shatter. Still, the militarist leadership urged the people to fight on in the emperor's name, urging every sacrifice. Schoolgirls trained with bamboo spears, kamikaze pilots took flight, willing to die for the empire. On the home islands, propaganda prepared the populace to perish to the last. Emperor Hirohito, during these desperate months, remained a distant, almost abstract presence. He presided over war council meetings and received reports, but never directly addressed the nation. Whether out of detachment or constraint, he did not halt the fanaticism that claimed millions of lives. By mid-1945, Japan was on its knees. Allied invasions had seized Okinawa, firebombing aids were incinerating Tokyo, and 2 atomic bombs had obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Amid this turmoil, the continued existence of the imperial house became a central question. The Allies' demand for unconditional surrender raised the specter that the victors might abolish the very monarchy that had led Japan into war. Some of Hirohito's military advisors argued for a last stand on home soil, preferring national suicide over a world without the divine emperor. Yet even on the eve of surrender, the mystique of the throne spurred fanaticism. In the pre-dawn hours of August 15, 1945, a band of die-hard army officers launched a last-ditch coup in Tokyo, determined to stop the shame of capitulation. They seized the imperial palace grounds in an attempt to find and destroy the phonograph record on which the emperor's secret message was encoded. The rebels even murdered several high officials in their frantic effort to preserve what they imagined was the emperor's honor, but their insurrection collapsed by morning. Loyal troops and palace guards protected the sacred precincts, and the all-important recording remained safe. The plot's failure meant that nothing would prevent the emperor's momentous words from reaching his subjects. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard their sovereign's voice for the first time ever. In a radio broadcast, speaking in formal court language, Hirohito announced that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that he had accepted the Allied surrender terms to prevent the obliteration of the nation. Stunned listeners struggled to grasp that the divine emperor was conceding defeat. Some wept in relief or despair. A few military diehards committed suicide rather than live to see the capitulation. In that moment, the emperor's infallible aura was irrecoverably punctured. He appeared not as an all-powerful deity, but as a human monarch trying to save his people from further suffering. In the months that followed, Allied occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Japan and found a populace still deeply reverent of the emperor. MacArthur astutely decided to use Hirohito as a stabilizing figure for the reconstruction of Japan. Allied leaders fiercely debated how to handle Japan's revered monarch. Some insisted the emperor must be abolished or tried as a war criminal, but General MacArthur argued that dismantling the throne could plunge Japan into chaos. Washington chose to preserve the imperial institution as a tool for stabilization. Thus, Hirohito was never brought to trial. Instead, under occupation authority, he was compelled to renounce in public the notion that he was divine. The new constitution of 1947 cemented the transformation of the imperial institution. It preserved the throne but stripped it of all political power. The emperor was henceforth the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, a ceremonial figurehead in a democratic Japan. It was a remarkable reversal of fortune. Yet this humbling of the monarchy paradoxically ensured its survival. By accepting a reduced apolitical role, the Yamato dynasty dodged the fate that befell many European thrones. Hirohito cooperated fully with the occupation reforms, lending his name to calls for peace and rebuilding, and the Japanese people, battered by defeat, still found comfort in the continuity represented by the imperial family. Amid the ashes of war, the post-war era brought a profound invention. Emperor Hirohito, stripped of political authority but retained as a symbol, devoted himself to an image of humble service. In a Japan rising from ruin, he toured the country, often dressed in a simple business suit rather than resplendent imperial robes, listening to the concerns of ordinary citizens. Photographs from the late 1940s and 1950s show Hirohito visiting farming villages and industrial exhibitions, a gentle smile on his face, as if to signal that the once distant divine sovereign was now a human companion in the nation's rebuilding. The strategy worked. The imperial family regained public goodwill. To a population struggling with privation, the continuity of the Yamato line offered comfort, a reassuring link to cultural identity and stability as Japan underwent rapid transformations. As Japan's economy boomed, the imperial institution settled into its constitutional role. Emperor Hirohito studiously avoided political controversy. Instead of becoming a patron of science, he was an accomplished marine biologist and a soft-spoken elder statesman. In 1971, he broke precedent to travel abroad, paying state visits to Europe, and in 1975, he visited the United States, gestures of reconciliation that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. These visits were met with a mix of curiosity and protest, but they symbolized Japan's return to the international community. At home, the monarch's birthday and public appearances became popular events, not out of blind adulation, but as part of a shared national tradition. The Chrysanthemum Throne, now firmly a symbol and nothing more, was broadly accepted by the Japanese people in a way it had perhaps never been when it wielded real power. When Emperor Hirohito, posthumously titled Emperor Showa, passed away in 1989, it marked the end of an era. His son, Emperor Akihito, assumed the throne as the Heisei Emperor and carried forward the work of humanizing and modernizing the royal image. Emperor Akihito and Empress Michiko, the first commoner to become empress, made a conscious effort to break down barriers between the monarchy and the public. They knelt to speak with survivors after natural disasters, visited nursing homes, and undertook unprecedented acts of outreach abroad. In 1992, Akihito became the first Japanese monarch ever to visit China, where he expressed heartfelt regret over the painful legacy of the war. A softly spoken gesture of reconciliation. Under Akihito, the imperial household continued to preserve ancient traditions such as the Daijosai sacred Thanksgiving rite, but it also quietly evolved to fit a democratic age. By the early 21st century, the Yamato dynasty had astonishingly endured into its third millennium. In 2019, in an unprecedented move in modern times indeed, the first voluntary abdication by a Japanese emperor in over 200 years, Emperor Akihito, abdicated due to age and health, passing the throne to his son, Emperor Naruhito, and ushering in the Reiwa era. Today's Japanese monarchy bears little resemblance to the past. In the new emperor's enthronement ceremonies, he was formally presented with the same sacred regalia, the mitre, sword, and curved jewel, that, according to mythology, were bestowed by the sun goddess millennia ago. Even in a high-tech age, these archaic treasures served as reminders that the imperial house remains rooted in ancient tradition. The emperor has no political authority and modestly styles himself as a symbol of the people's unity. Yet the fact that the imperial line persists at all is remarkable. In a world where most ancient monarchies have vanished, the Yamato house remains a living link to legends of antiquity. The journey has not been without its stains. Debates occasionally flare about the future of the throne, such as the role of women in succession or the expense of supporting a royal household in a democracy. Such questions of continuity illustrate the delicate balance between preserving ancient precedent and societal change. But in the decades since World War II, the monarchy has managed to adapt and endure by embracing its strictly symbolic role. Freed from the burdens of ruling, it has become a mirror of the nation's collective memory and hopes. In times of disaster or celebration, the imperial family provides a point of gentle solidarity. A visit to a tsunami-struck region or a congratulatory message at an Olympics gestures small yet reassuring. In this way, the eternal throne continues on into the present, not as a driver of Japan's destiny, but as a guardian of its heritage. Having survived feudal usurpers, ideological zealots, fire and sword, and total defeat in war, the Yamato Dynasty stands as an extraordinary case of institutional resilience. It is evident in modern times that illustrates a hard-earned wisdom, that sometimes the greatest power of an institution lies in its ability to change and in knowing when to relinquish power in order to survive. The saga of Japan's imperial family is a study in continuity and change, a living bridge between a mythic past and present realities. Few institutions on earth have weathered as many transformations. Over the ages, the Chrysanthemum Throne has been the fulcrum of splendid court cultures, the pawn of warlords, the rallying point of nationalism, and now the quiet figurehead of a peaceful democracy. This journey has imparted lessons with large significance in the annals of history. One lesson is the remarkable power of tradition. The idea of an unbroken sacred lineage conferred a unique resilience, allowing the throne to endure shocks that might have shattered less rooted dynasties. At the same time, that very aura of sanctity, when harnessed to temporal ambitions, proved double-edged, capable of driving both noble unity and devastating folly. Like the sun goddess from whom the dynasty claims descent, the imperial line has often been a constant light for Japan, sometimes blazing at the center of national life, sometimes reduced to a faint glow in the background, but never extinguished. Throughout the generations, the Yamato dynasty managed to survive by adapting, sometimes by wielding authority, but more often by yielding it. Unlike the royal houses of many other lands, it was never overthrown by a rival clan or colonize, in part because even Japan's conquerors found it wise to rule in the emperor's name than to eliminate him. In essence, the throne's weakness became its strength. Its political passivity at times allowed it to outlast the turbulence of samurai coups and foreign occupations. Yet the 20th century showed that placing a charismatic ideal above accountability can have dire consequences. The near union of Japan in World War II underscored that even a throne claiming divine origin must ultimately answer to human responsibility and ethics. The imperial institution endured that trial by transforming itself, disavowing claims of divinity, and embracing the role of servant leader in spirit. From a humble tribal realm, the Yamato dynasty grew in tandem with the Japanese nation itself. In one era, it trailed quietly behind the generals and statesmen who steered history. In another, it charged to the fore as the embodiment of the nation's will. In House of Crisis, the throne was a beacon, at times a beacon of hope allying the people, at other times a beacon that led them down a dangerous path. In tranquil periods, it served as a comforting reminder of continuity amid change. Each generation of emperors faced the tests of its time. Foreign invasions, civil wars, evolutionary reforms, or moral reckonings. And in meeting those trials, they indelibly shaped the nature of Japan. Today, the image of the emperor conducting Shinto rites in a modern suit or consoling disaster victims embodies a legacy that is neither wholly glorious nor entirely tragic, but richly human. The Yamato line's very survival into the contemporary era invites reflection. It reminds us that modern nationhood is not solely the product of constitutions and elections. It is also shaped by enduring cultural touchstones that anchor a people's sense of identity. The Japanese monarchy, with its timeless rituals, provides a ceremonial rhythm that links today's busy, technologically advanced society with its ancient sacred beginnings. In a sense, the emperors have become gardeners of tradition, tending a national memory that might otherwise fade in the rush of progress. The story of Japan's eternal throne is still being written. Each new empire and each generation of Japanese must decide what this ancient institution means to them. Will it remain a cherished symbol of unity and cultural heritage? Will it evolve further to face new challenges in a changing world? The answers will unfold with time, but the historical record is clear about one thing. The ability of the Yamato dynasty to navigate the consequences of history has been nothing short of extraordinary.